It is the most famous city that never existed. Or did it? Camelot. A name that conjures images of gleaming spires bursting through the mist, a beacon of law, and a promise of perfect equality in a brutal world. Inside those high stone battlements, legends describe a sprawling fortress, a central hall defined by sweeping arches and brilliant light, where the finest warriors in silver plate armor gathered to define the highest ideals of chivalry. Yet, despite serving as the foundational DNA for 1,000 years of Western storytelling, this gleaming metropolis is completely absent from the actual historical landscape of early medieval Britain. The name Camelot itself, along with the towering stone architecture, doesn't appear in the earliest British chronicles. It was introduced centuries later, around the 12th century, by a French poet named Chrétien de Troyes. As the story traveled from the Iron Age forts of Wales to the royal courts of France, the original, rugged strongholds of the Britons were systematically overwritten. In their place, poets wove elaborate tapestries of grand feasts and soaring blue-flagged castles. The Camelot embedded in our modern imagination is a triumph of 12th century literary engineering. Stripping away that romantic fiction leaves us with a stark historical question. What kind of reality was the original Arthur actually fighting to protect? At the center of this romanticized court sits the Round Table. Commissioned by the wizard Merlin, its design served a highly specific purpose: structural equality. It ensured that no single knight could claim physical precedence or a seat of higher honor, forging a brotherhood of absolute peers. From this table, those knights launched the ultimate spiritual test, the quest for the Holy Grail. This pursuit elevated Camelot from a simple military fortress into a new Jerusalem on British soil, where divine virtue and human honor intersected. The city ultimately falls from within. The forbidden romance between Lancelot and Queen Guinevere splinters the fellowship, turning former brothers-in-arms against one another and fracturing the very equality the table was built to maintain. The tragic arc concludes at the Battle of Camlan. Stripped of the protective scabbard of Excalibur by his son Mordred, Arthur is mortally wounded. The era ends in a crimson sunset, with the legendary sword returned to the water and the king taken away to the mystical Isle of Avalon. This narrative arc was engineered to serve as a moral compass for a violently fractured medieval society. It presented an idealized code of honor, a dream that ultimately proved too fragile to survive the inherent flaws of the humans who built it. To find the historical bedrock beneath that poetry, we have to rewind 700 years. We leave the polished marble of the 12th century and enter the grim iron and mud reality of 5th century Britain. Look at this map of the British Isles. As the Roman Empire collapses, we see their formalized defensive lines and military borders completely dissolve. This rapid withdrawal leaves the remaining Roman-British citizens entirely exposed. Into that sudden power vacuum, aggressive Saxon invaders pour in from the continent. These vectors show them flooding across the eastern coastline, brutally pushing the native defenders back into the western hills. Historical records identify this leader as a Dux Bellorum, a hardened Roman-style battle commander. He relied on highly mobile cavalry units to strike back at the advancing Saxons before they could entrench. His seat of power looked absolutely nothing like a French castle. The military command centers of this era were rugged hill forts built from timber, crude earthworks, and stacked stone. The earliest Welsh bards singing of this commander never uttered the word Camelot. They anchored their stories to actual, formidable strongholds scattered across the landscape, like the jagged coastal fortress of Tintagel. The true origin of the legend lies in this bloody, desperate last stand to keep the Dark Ages at bay. It was the grit and iron reality of a nation struggling to survive the fall of Rome. For over a millennium, the gap between that embattled 5th century cavalry commander and the glowing 12th century literary myth was bridged entirely by oral tradition and woven tapestries. But modern archaeology is no longer satisfied with folklore. We've moved from storyteller to scientist, where claims demand hard evidence. Researchers are now deploying thermal imaging and high-definition aerial scans. This visualization illustrates how a LiDAR laser grid maps the terrain, allowing us to digitally strip away the sod and reveal hidden ruins. These scans identify massive 5th century earthworks and repurposed Roman structures. Findings like old Roman amphitheaters mirror the circular dimensions of the Round Table. Archaeologists will never dig up a wooden signpost bearing the name Camelot. However, the earth is yielding undeniable proof of the fortified command centers that inspired the legend. Camelot's ultimate value is a psychological anchor, forging a shared cultural identity for a fractured nation. The story that began as a fight for survival is finally leaving a physical trail. Behind the glowing legends of a perfect court are the iron-willed people who stood their ground, held the line, and fought back the dark. When we think of Camelot, we picture towering French-style castles, knights in shining plate armor, and brightly colored banners. To find the real King Arthur, you have to shatter that image. It is historically false. To find the truth, we have to go back to the early 5th century. The Roman legions had just abandoned Britain, leaving the island supposedly vulnerable to the chaotic violence of the Dark Ages. Yet historical records from the time point to a different reality. They describe a fierce, highly organized British resistance holding the line, commanded by a warlord bearing the title Comes Britanniarum, the Count of the Britons. For centuries, we looked for the wrong ruins. Today, using deep trench excavation and satellite surveillance, we are mapping the landscape through 21st century forensic data. These technologies allow us to map the physical infrastructure of a ghost kingdom, identifying the iron, the clay pottery, and the blood of a civilization that actually held the line against the Dark Ages. A surviving state requires raw defensive power. The strongest candidate for that military muscle sits in Somerset, at Cadbury Castle. Cadbury is a massive engineering project built during the Age of Arthur. It features a mile-long perimeter of reinforced stone and timber defenses. Ground-penetrating radar maps the layout beneath the soil, revealing architectural sophistication far beyond a typical hill fort. At the summit, radar mapped the foundations of a grand feasting hall. Nearby, excavators found high-status Mediterranean pottery, proof of global trade connections. Constructing these defenses required thousands of coordinated laborers and a complex logistical chain. Cadbury functioned as the heavily fortified military seat of a king with the power to mobilize an entire region. Beyond military power, a functioning state needs wealth and culture. In Cornwall, at the site of Tintagel, we find the second requirement of the resistance. Excavations reveal Tintagel was a massive, elite palace complex dating to the 5th and 6th centuries. Archaeologists have recovered vast quantities of luxury goods here, specifically high-end ceramics and glass imported directly from the Byzantine Empire. These imports prove this kingdom maintained sophisticated global trade routes, keeping Roman cultural traditions alive long after the legions left. Physical evidence of literacy also remains. This 1,500-year-old slate found at the site is inscribed with Latin names from the Arthurian era. Tintagel served as the cosmopolitan hub of the resistance, an elite center where Roman wealth and literacy continued to thrive. The final pillar is administrative infrastructure. To see how the Britons managed their resistance, we look to Wroxeter, the ancient Roman city of Viroconium. While other Roman cities in Britain were abandoned or burned, Viroconium was meticulously rebuilt. The British resistance built massive timber halls directly on top of the cold Roman stone foundations in the late 5th century. This deliberate urban renewal indicates a centralized administrative heart required to run a united Britain. Viroconium provided the actual urban reality that inspired the later legends of a grand capital city. When we pull these 3 geographic locations together, the true nature of the kingdom emerges. Camelot exists as a highly organized, distributed network. It utilized military power at Cadbury, international wealth at Tintagel, and civic administration at Viroconium. Arthur, whoever the historical man was, served as the strategic architect of this network, keeping Roman order alive in a crumbling world. The legend survives because its foundations are built on the physical stones of a Britain that refused to fall. Arthur represents the man who held the light until we were ready to see again.